Ezekiel 38 tells us when the nations attack Israel, Saudi Arabia will object to the attack. The modern day implications of that fact alone should make us pay very close attention to what's happening in Saudi Arabia right now. This is what you need to know. All right, folks, let's get into this. Of course, we continue to read passages like this all the time, but I think it's important to establish the foundation for why we conclude what we conclude. And guys, I cannot tell you enough. This is so critical. When you stop for a moment to look at what the Bible says will happen in the future with the Middle East, what's going to take place when Israel is attacked by Gog, presumably the leader of Russia, and Magog, and all of these other nations that join in, all of the stands in Turkey and all of these other countries, when they seek to attack, you need to understand that Saudi Arabia is going to object to that attack. Let me read to you the passage. It's very, very interesting. And of course, many of you have heard me read through this from the very beginning, but what I will do is I'll start right at verse 10. It says this. It says, this is Ezekiel 38. Thus saith the Lord God, it shall also come to pass that at that time shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought. And thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. That's describing, by the way, Israel as being a country that is filled with peace. Okay? Like literally, Israel does not have unwalled villages right now. I mean, it's amazing that it's got to get to that place before we see Ezekiel 38 happen. And it will happen, by the way. But look what it says. Let me read it again. And thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates, to take a spoil, to take a prey, to turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations which have gotten cattle and goods that dwell in the midst of the land. So what we know is that when these nations go to attack Israel, they want to take what Israel has. And of course, we already know that Israel is rich with all kinds of natural resources. Just the innovations in farming that they have done alone is remarkable and beyond the capacity of a lot of people to really understand. I mean, there are people who study years and years and years and years and cannot grasp some of the technology that's been deployed in Israel for just growing beautiful, beautiful fruit and things like that in the middle of the desert. It's incredible. So Israel has a lot of remarkable natural resources. Look at the offshore drilling that's happening in the Mediterranean. Lots of natural gas Israel has. They have one of the largest oil reserves in the whole world. So there is so much that Israel has. And by the way, let me make myself clear. I'm not talking about the Solomon Temple era when I say this about gold, although there's a ton of gold that they don't know where it is related to the First Temple period. The one thing that I'm going to say here that you should pay attention to is that Israel has a ton of gold, separate of the gold that's buried away from all of the artifacts of the temple. A lot of people believe that Israel is sitting on one of the largest gold reserves in the world as well. So there's a lot of things that these people could come back for. They want to take a spoil. They want to take a prey. We know in verse 12 that they are going to come for something that they want that Israel has. And Israel has a lot of things that people want. But look what it says in verse 13. This is the one I want you to pay attention to. Sheba and Dedan, that's Saudi Arabia, okay? Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions thereof shall say unto thee, art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to take a great spoil? So they're going to say, are you nuts? Like, you're really going to make this about lining your pockets? You're really going to make this about, come on. What you're doing isn't even making sense. What's wrong with you? Now, this is important to note, because if we know that Saudi Arabia will be the nation that will object to this type of thing, then that also has to mean that Saudi Arabia is going to be a nation that is going to be known and respected for, leading up into that time, wanting to make peace, wanting to bring prosperity to the region. And folks, we're already seeing that happening. Look at all of the things that's going on all over the Middle East and in the Persian Gulf. Should I even be talking about Oman and Abu Dhabi and the UAE and some of the things that they're doing right now with Iraq and Kuwait? Should we talk about the idea that they want to develop this normalization agreement that's going to create this massive new trade route that's going to change the way things flow from areas like India all the way into the Mediterranean? Look at what they're doing with Egypt and making Egypt very happy and seeking to subsidize some of the loss in revenue that's going to take place from the Suez Canal. Look at some of the agreements that they're coming to with respect to how they're handling Yemen, how they're working with even China in some respects to be able to make things right. Folks, Saudi Arabia is taking very seriously the things that are happening. And by the way, they are concerned about the nations that are on their borders. That's why they're regularly talking to Kuwait and Iraq and, of course, Jordan. Listen, Riyadh is talking to Yemen all the time. And, of course, they're also talking to Syria, even though they don't really have to. Of course, they're spending a lot of time talking to Israel using back channels. But this stuff is becoming very significant because they see the gold mine in it. So when you hear of a time where Saudi Arabia will object to all of this crazy stuff, you need to pay attention to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a nation that as they come up in the news, you should be paying attention. Now, I thought that it would be really cool to read to you an opinion article that was just published by somebody in JNS, okay? And I don't even know who Amin Ayoub is, but my understanding is that he's a policy analyst and he comes from Morocco. But the insight that he's bringing here with respect to what's going on to Saudi Arabia gives you a really good idea of what a lot of people in the mainstream are thinking. And so when I read this to you, it will help you to be able to better understand how everybody is thinking with respect to what's happening right now in Saudi Arabia and how significant that dynamic actually is. So let's get in and read this here. By the way, this was written in JNS, and so it's a really good article. And the title of the article, and again, it's an opinion article, is Saudi Arabia's Geopolitical Moves. Very simple, but folks, I'm going to tell you this right now. It is railing with the question of, can the kingdom of Saudi Arabia be trusted to broker lasting peace? That's the big question that everybody is asking. And by the way, if there's anybody that can do it, or at least we think can do it, it's probably going to be Mohammed bin Shalmin. I'm almost certain of it. MBS guaranteed is going to be the person who's going to move it in that direction. I can only imagine that that's exactly what's going to happen here. So let's read this. Saudi Arabia has long positioned itself as a central player in the Middle East, aiming to influence regional stability and global geopolitics. By the way, that's a very true statement. Riyadh has always wanted to do this. It's all about the expansion of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in a way that brings prosperity not only to themselves, but prosperity to the people around them, because they know when people around them prosper, then they can better secure their own interests, and they are able to create a better infrastructure for themselves around the world. And they've always known that Israel is a part of that. I can't tell you that enough. And by the way, the area that he's going to mention right now, which is this Riyadh summit, we've done some coverage on it. We've talked about it. We've talked about one of the statements that MBS made and why it was basically what I would call a front-loaded statement. It was a statement that was designed to fulfill a specific requirement that's based on the expectation of all of these leaders, people like Erdogan and some of these other leaders. But in essence, it is a premise for seeking normalization with Israel. Very, very important that we look at that. Matter of fact, I did a video on this, I think I want to say last week sometime or the week before, where we talked about this very summit. It's really important. But he goes on to say the Riyadh summit earlier this month, where Crown Prince Mohammed bin Shalmin addressed key issues facing the Muslim world, brought this role into sharper focus. However, as the kingdom seeks to navigate complex geopolitical tensions, such as its evolving relationship with Iran, its criticisms of Israel, and its involvement in ongoing conflicts like Yemen, the question arises, can Saudi Arabia be trusted to broker lasting peace, especially when its own internal and external challenges, including its human rights record, remain prominent? Can that be done? And yeah, that's a valid question, okay? There are some human rights questions that come up with Saudi Arabia, but listen, there's human rights questions, if you're honest, with every single country that come up. It's not just one country. It's literally every single country. We have human rights issues here in the United States of America, especially when we're tearing babies apart in their womb. But that's a whole other issue. It goes on to say, at the heart of the Riyadh summit was a discussion on Palestinian statehood and the ongoing conflict with Israel. In a notable departure from its previous diplomatic trajectory, bin Salman took a more assertive stance, openly condemning Israel's actions in Gaza and accusing it of genocide against Palestinians. He emphasized the need for the internal community to ensure Israel respects Iranian sovereignty, signaling a potential shift in Saudi Arabia's stance towards Israel and a move towards closer ties with Tehran. By the way, let me just tell you something. He's reading this wrong, okay? I am going to disagree with the analysis that he's bringing to the table. I think that the statement that he made with respect to this accusation of genocide is something that, if you listen to it in Arabic, can be taken in different ways. I actually believe that what's happening here is he is playing a very, very, very fine line on a very sharp edge game when it comes to seeking to sort of cut through the different nuances that need to in order for him to do what he wants to do. There's no way he's going to be able to create an agreement of normalcy unless he acknowledges the Palestinian state, as he would put it. But at the same time, he also knows that he's not going to be able to create any form of normalization agreement or function of normalization if he also doesn't understand that the head of the snake needs to be cut off, that he needs to get rid of Iran. He needs to stop the disgusting stance of Mahmoud Abbas, and he needs to end Hezbollah and, of course, Hamas. And, of course, it wouldn't harm him if they got rid of Islamic Brotherhood as well. They're all looking at these things to be removed, and they're working very closely with countries like Egypt. And believe it or not, they're working very closely with Israel, although nobody really wants to admit it. All of this is happening, and I think that his view of this section is a bit shallow, but that's the view of the rest of the world. That's how they look at it. So the paragraph goes on to say, this stance appeared to mark a clear pivot away from previous talks aimed at normalizing relations with Israel, which had been a priority under former President Donald Trump's first administration. While Saudi Arabia had expressed interest in recognizing Israel in exchange for security guarantees and regional stability, particularly in light of shared concerns about Iran, the kingdom's rhetoric at the Riyadh summit highlighted growing divisions in its foreign policy. This shift is significant, especially given that Saudi Arabia's rapprochement with Iran in 2023, brokered by China, has already reshaped the regional diplomatic landscape. Of course, it's reshaped the regional diplomatic landscape. It's doing it because Saudi Arabia is playing the juggling game. This is what they have to do. But make no mistake about it, Riyadh has no respect for Tehran, okay? I promise you, that's not happening. Saudi Arabia's growing ties with Iran, along with its criticisms of Israel, suggest a more independent foreign policy that is less reliant on the United States than it has been in recent decades. Bingo! That's the issue. Saudi Arabia is playing this game of touch and go with all of these other nations because they don't trust America. And I did a video of this the other day that very much highlights this issue. We created this. Okay, this is the Biden regime that created this when they did what they did with the Yemeni Houthis. Okay, we literally completely cut Saudi Arabia off at the knees, and nobody should be surprised by it. Now, this makes Saudi Arabia's role as a potential peace broker more complex. While Riyadh's attempts at fostering diplomacy, such as encouraging dialogue between Iran and its regional allies, have been welcomed by some, its ability to mediate without bias, particularly in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, remains an open question. Of course it's an open question, because Saudi Arabia will never take the side of Iran or its proxies in the stance and what's going on in Israel. No way will they let that happen. No way. The trustworthiness of Saudi Arabia as a mediator in regional conflicts must be assessed in terms of its internal and external challenges. On the one hand, Saudi Arabia's geopolitical clout, bolstered by its vast oil wealth and strategic position in the Gulf, makes it an important player in the shaping of regional outcomes. On the other hand, its internal governance and human rights issues raise concerns about its stability to advocate for genuine peace that prioritizes the welfare of ordinary people, especially those living in conflict zones. I don't know what this Moroccan guy is doing. Okay? I don't know what his goal is in providing this opinion. I think his opinion is intelligent. I think that he's saying a lot of things that make sense if you're looking at all of this stuff on the surface. But I need you to understand, especially if you can understand Arabic, I need you to understand that there is more than meets the eye here. Saudi Arabia is sitting on both sides of the fence, and they have to, in order to navigate in the direction that they need. I can promise you, once they get certain guarantees given to them in stone and they see the deployment of those guarantees through normalization, they are going to throw out the idea that they have to work with Iran or anybody else in order to substantiate normalization. They're going to run away from it. They have to. Their own national security is dramatically affected by it. The last thing they want is for Iran to prosper. The last thing that they want is for Iran to develop a nuclear strategy. The last thing that they want is for Iran to even develop a nuclear weapon. They don't want it. So they're going to do everything that they can to sandbag it. And the way that they're doing it is by taking on the role that they're taking on right now. It's really important that we see this. Internally, Saudi Arabia has faced ongoing criticism for its human rights record, the government's suppression of political dissent, its treatment of women and minority groups, and the use of harsh measures against activists and journalists, including the high-profile killing of Washington Post reporter Jamal Khashoggi in 2018, remain major points of contention. These issues have led many to question Saudi Arabia's commitment to universal human rights, especially when its foreign policy often appears driven by pragmatic authoritarian priorities. By the way, I just want to make myself clear. They keep talking about human rights, while these same people are supporting the destruction of a baby in a mother's womb, okay? I'm not trying to defend Saudi Arabia's human rights record, but what I am trying to say is stop using it as a pretext for coming to a conclusion that they can't be worthy to be dealt with in the region. It's a foolish statement. And by the way, Israel knows this. Israel knows that their ticket to be able to find the kind of security that they need to find is going to happen through the Arabian Peninsula. And the only way that they can make that work is by developing a close relationship with Riyadh. Jerusalem has to be close to Riyadh. There's no other way around it. And Riyadh knows that they have to be close to Jerusalem. It's super, super important. But look at the example that he gives, because this is really important. And by the way, I do highly disagree with his analysis on Yemen. I do. I don't see it the way that he sees it. I think he's missing some very critical points, but that also could be the regional influence that drives him to write what he writes. He says, for instance, the war in Yemen, which Saudi Arabia has led since 2015, has been a focal point of international criticism due to the humanitarian crisis it has created. Tens of thousands of people have died and millions more have been displaced, yet the conflict shows little sign of resolution. The Saudi-led coalition has faced accusations of war crimes, including indiscriminate airstrikes that have killed civilians and targeted vital infrastructure, further complicating its image as a promoter of peace. By the way, I'm just going to tell you this right now. If all of this is happening on a regular basis, which some of it is, why in the world don't we see it in the media the same way we see Gaza happening in the media? Or Hezbollah, for that example. This is the kind of hypocrisy that we see all over the Middle East. He goes on to say this contradiction between Saudi Arabia's role as a peacemaker on the world stage and its representative tactics at home and in foreign interventions cast doubt on whether the kingdom is a reliable or impartial actor in conflict resolution. Saudi Arabia's recent rhetoric, particularly at the Riyadh summit, underscores its desire to reshape its role in the region. However, it is important to consider whether these efforts are driven by a genuine commitment to peace or whether they are part of a broader geopolitical strategy. They are undoubtedly, folks, part of a broader geopolitical strategy. And I'm glad that this guy is pointing this out. That's why I call him smart. MBS's condemnation of Israel and his call for international action to protect Iran's sovereignty may reflect Riyadh's evolving relationship with Tehran, but they could also be seen as an attempt to consolidate power and influence in a volatile region. And I'm going to say this, it is them seeking to consolidate power and influence. I promise you, they are looking to make certain people completely negligible. They're looking to do that. They're seeking to do that with Iran. They're seeking to do that with a few other people because they know it's their only path or their only ticket to be able to do what they want. Saudi Arabia wants G7 really bad, folks. That's a big part of all these discussions that we continue to have regarding these issues. Now, this is one aspect of this article that I really want you to pay attention to, folks. It says this: moreover, Saudi Arabia's increasing reliance on China as a diplomatic partner has allowed it to broker important agreements with Iran, signaling a shift away from the West. While this shift could help reduce tensions in the region, it also means that Saudi Arabia's conflict resolution efforts may be influenced by its strategic alliances, potentially limiting its ability to act as a neutral party. Of course, they're not going to act as a neutral party. They have to foster the relationship that they want with the West, because without that relationship with the West, they cannot pursue what they need in Israel. And without them being able to pursue what they need in Israel, they don't have trade routes. They don't have the ability to wield their economic power to manipulate other nations on board, and they lose their influence in the region of the Gulf. It's a really important thing to be mindful of. He goes on to say the kingdom's role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is another example of its complexity. On one hand, Saudi Arabia has historically been a vocal supporter of Palestinian right, yet its willingness to normalize relations with Israel in exchange for security arrangements and other benefits underscores the transactional nature of its diplomacy. The apparent contradiction between MBS's condemnation of Israeli actions in Gaza and his interest in normalizing relations with Israel only months ago illustrates how Saudi Arabia's foreign policy is often driven by shifting geopolitical interests rather than a constant ethical stance. And by the way, I will tell you this, if there's any Middle Eastern country that is not driven by a specific idealism that's founded or fundamentally predicated upon Islam, it's going to be Saudi Arabia, believe it or not, even though they are the ones who basically facilitate and host the most holy city in all of Islam, right? Very interesting to think about all of this, especially when you start looking at Mecca and it's complicated. For Saudi Arabia to be truly trusted as a facilitator of lasting peace, it would need to demonstrate a commitment to resolving conflicts impartially without ulterior motives and show a willingness to address its own internal human rights issues. Until such changes occur, the country's ability to lead a meaningful peace process, especially in its own neighborhood, will remain a topic of skepticism and debate. And this is where I need you to pay attention, folks, because by virtue of the fact that Saudi Arabia is being viewed with great skepticism and debate, as this guy would put it, specifically within the context of being a peacemaker in the region, is exactly what is needed in order for Saudi Arabia to take the position that it does, that we read about in Ezekiel 38. It creates a sense of neutrality within the region that sort of quells some of the issues that you might expect to see. It literally holds things at bay. Folks, I can give you an example of this, okay, in how this looks like. When Iran attacked Israel by launching all these missiles in that direction, Saudi Arabia intercepted many of them. Now, Saudi Arabia, prior to that time, looked like it was very sympathetic towards Iran, especially since some of the recent meetings that had taken place. Yet at the same time, they are defending Israel. So this complexity and the difficulty in being able to understand or see where Saudi Arabia is coming from in the things that they're doing is the very tool that is being used to give Saudi Arabia the footing that it needs in order to be able to be the person who plays fine with everybody. This is a very rare breed picture that we're seeing right now. And this is why I'm telling you guys to pay special attention to the Middle East. Okay, but I really want you to pay very special attention to Saudi Arabia. Why is that? First of all, just look at the geography. Look at the map. Just by simply looking at the map, it will make you more aware of why Saudi Arabia is so significant. Saudi Arabia determines how the bridge gets gapped between the East and the West. If Saudi Arabia does what they claim or purport to want to do, it changes all of the Middle East. Nothing will remain the same. And quite frankly, what America did to Saudi Arabia very much changed the Middle East because it changed the way Saudi Arabia operated. It changed its MO. Saudi Arabia went way more sophisticated than it was in dealing with all of these diplomatic problems that continue to come up. Their diplomacy is second to none, and the efforts that they are making in wanting to change the shape of how their diplomatic footing looks like is something that is changed so radically that if you were an expert on Saudi Arabia 5 years ago, you would not know the Saudi Arabia that you're seeing today. I mean, that's how much things have changed. And so you have to pay attention to this. You have to look at it. Just simply looking at it from geography, you've got to pay attention to it. You also have to look at it to understand what the flavor of the Islamic world is going to be in the upcoming years. If you are able to get a good grasp on what's happening in Saudi Arabia, you're going to be better and more capable of being able to understand the dynamic that exists in Islam, because everything that centers around Saudi Arabia is going to be the place where it all launches from. I'll give you an example of this. MBS is going out of his way right now to take Jerusalem off the map, not in the sense of blowing it up or getting rid of it or anything like that. He wants to take it off the map by making it Israel's sole place to worship. He wants it to be a place of worship for the Jews because he knows that Mecca didn't, or the Mecca of Saudi Arabia per se, didn't even exist during the time of Muhammad. So obviously Muhammad has to be somebody all the way from Turkey or even Damascus for that matter. And it's not the same person that they're talking about in Islam. And if that's the case, then the focus of it all gets thrown away. The significance of Saudi Arabia and its impact that it has on the Islamic world also changes. And the bridge that Saudi Arabia becomes to the rest of the world is completely different. Think about it. If you're a Muslim and you live anywhere in the world, where do you have to go? You got to go to Mecca. You have to. It's the responsibility that's been given to you. Saudi Arabia understands the notoriety that comes with that. Saudi Arabia understands how its validity and its very own national security footing is made stronger in that. And here's the other reason why we got to pay attention to Saudi Arabia. We have to pay attention to Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia is going to act as a thermometer for the things that we're seeing and that we know to expect to see in the last days. The scenarios that we see being played out in the tribulation are going to be fueled by what starts in Saudi Arabia. So when you see news coming out of Saudi Arabia, you have to pay attention to it. By the way, just like when you see news coming out of the Temple Mount or Israel, you got to pay attention to it. Saudi Arabia becomes a very complicated leg of that. And if you're not paying attention to it, if you're not reading and you're not, finding out what's going on and digging deeper into all of these things, you're going to struggle immensely with understanding the greater or the bigger picture with the geopolitics of the region. And by the way, one last thing that I want to point out regarding Saudi Arabia, okay? And this is the final thing you should pay attention to. Saudi Arabia will serve as a canary in the coal mine. It will literally tell you where things are going, and it will serve as one of the safer indicators to show you when danger is around the corner in that region or when there's peace around the corner. Because when Saudi Arabia goes in a specific direction, the rest of the Middle Eastern world is going to follow. Whether or not they want to admit that, whether or not they want to talk about it, folks, that is the place that we're in. So with all of that said, I want you guys to pay attention to this stuff. Look, the other thing that you have to do, and I'll close off with simply saying this, is the more you know the word of God, the more you give yourself to it, the more you allow yourself to become tightly wounded within it, the more confidence you will have in understanding the things that you're seeing. It's hard to explain. You have to study it to understand what I'm talking about. The more you read, the more you begin to draw these parallels, the more you begin to connect the dots. It will always be because you're reading the Bible more and more. The more you read the Bible, the better you're going to understand what you're looking at. So folks, I cannot tell you enough. Read the Bible. And finally, let me just say this. Last thing, and I'll close with this. All the hope you could ever want is in the Word, because the Bible tells us the future. The promise of the future is remarkable. If you love the Word of God, you know God has nothing but great things in store for us. And that should excite you, folks. That should make you so blessed, because the greatest things, the best is yet to come. The Bible tells us that. So get excited in these last days. Look forward to the things that you're seeing. There's some amazing things that are happening. And although I can't tell you when the second coming is going to be, I can tell you it's pretty far away because we haven't seen all these things that have to happen first. And although I can't tell you when the rapture is going to happen, I can tell you that the imminency of the rapture should be something we think about, because Christ can come back at any moment. And folks, when it happens, it's going to be glorious. Be found doing the work of God. Be found sharing the good news. Be found talking to people about these things. Literally living the Bible out, not burying your talent. Because our master's coming back. He's been on a long, faraway journey. He's coming back. And he needs to find us faithful. I want to be found faithful. I hope you will be. Why? Because the future doesn't just look bright, folks. The future looks powerful. The future looks exciting. The future looks remarkable. God's done so much for us. How could you not be excited? God bless you guys.